The day was sunny, and the birds were singing, making it seem like a perfect morning for a fresh start. The man, who had recently moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, stepped outside, eager to begin settling into his new home. He had spent weeks packing and organizing his old life, and now he was ready to embrace the new one. The house was everything he had hoped for: peaceful, spacious, and located in a community that seemed welcoming and friendly. It had taken him some time to find this place, but he felt that moving here was the right decision. The small garage at the back was perfect for his car, which he loved dearly. It was his prized possession, and he made sure to keep it in good shape. It was an old model, but it had a history. He loved taking it for long drives through the city, feeling the freedom on the road. On this particular day, he stood by the open garage, preparing to take his car for a short spin. He had just finished unpacking the last of his boxes inside, and he was eager to drive around the neighborhood, see what else it had to offer, and perhaps meet a few of the neighbors. His fingers brushed the car's smooth surface as he admired its shiny blue paint. He had always taken care of it, and it had always been there for him during difficult times. Little did he know, across the street, one of his new neighbors was watching him from her window. This woman, known by the other residents as Karen, had a reputation in the neighborhood for being quick to judge and always certain that she knew what was best for everyone. She was often seen walking around, telling people what to do and how to live their lives, especially when it came to enforcing the rules of the community. She was the kind of person who was always in everyone's business, making sure everyone followed the strict set of unwritten rules she had in mind. And today, her watchful eyes had fixed on him, standing by his car, ready to leave. At first, Karen simply watched. She had a habit of observing her neighbors, making mental notes about who they were and what they did. But something about this man caught her attention. She wasn't sure why, but something about him standing near his car felt wrong. Maybe it was the fact that he was black. Maybe it was the way he casually opened the garage door. Either way, her mind started to race. What if he was up to something? What if he was stealing a car? It didn't seem likely, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her thoughts spiraled out of control. She stood by the window for a few moments, unable to decide what to do. Finally, convinced that she had to take action, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. "I need to report a suspicious person," she said in a rushed voice. "There's a black man in the garage across the street. I think he's stealing a car." Her voice quivered with urgency, even though she had no real evidence to support her claim. But to her, it was enough. She had seen him and believed she had to act quickly. As she described the situation, her mind raced through every possible outcome. Was this man really stealing the car, or was she just overreacting? She couldn't be sure, but the fear she felt was too much for her to ignore. She explained to the dispatcher that she had seen the man enter the garage and open the door. The fact that he wasn't dressed in a uniform or something that clearly marked him as the owner of the car made her suspicious. After all, why would anyone else be in a garage unless they were up to no good? Meanwhile, the man continued to prepare for his short drive. He wasn't aware of the eyes watching him from across the street. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life, sending a small cloud of exhaust into the air. He smiled to himself as he adjusted the rearview mirror. His first drive in this neighborhood felt like an important moment. He hoped the neighbors would be as friendly as he imagined, and maybe today he'd finally get to meet them. But as he backed the car out of the garage, he heard something that made his heart race: a loud knock on the door. The man glanced toward the driveway, confused. Was it a neighbor? Or perhaps a delivery? But before he could react, a car pulled up to the curb with flashing lights. Suddenly, the peaceful morning turned into a scene of confusion and uncertainty. Two police officers stepped out of the patrol car, their eyes scanning the area as they approached him. The man's stomach dropped. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just getting in his car for a quick drive. His mind raced as the officers walked toward him. "Is this your vehicle?" one of the officers asked, looking him up and down. The other officer stood by the patrol car, watching the interaction closely. "Yes, it's my car," the man responded, feeling the tension rise. He wasn't sure why they were asking, but he could sense something was off. His pulse quickened, and he felt his hands starting to sweat. The officers didn't look threatening, but the situation was becoming uncomfortable. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to understand why the police were there. He wasn't sure if he should be worried. "Is there a problem?" "We received a call," the officer explained, "about a possible theft. We need to confirm that this car belongs to you." The man's confusion only deepened. Who could have possibly made such a call? He hadn't done anything wrong, and he was certain he was just minding his own business. But as the officer stood in front of him, the situation felt more serious than he expected. What was happening? Why was this happening to him? Before he could say anything else, Karen stepped outside, holding a clipboard in her hand, clearly proud of herself for what she had done. The officers turned to her, waiting for an explanation. "There he is," Karen said, pointing directly at the man. "I saw him open the garage and start the car. It looked like he was stealing it. I'm just trying to keep this neighborhood safe." The man's heart sank. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had never met Karen before, and here she was accusing him of something he had no intention of doing. His mind struggled to process the words she had just said. She was the one who had called the police on him. The idea that someone would think he was a thief simply because of the color of his skin was terrifying. He had never felt so powerless. The officers glanced at each other, the doubt starting to form in their expressions. The man could see that they were beginning to question Karen's story, but the damage had already been done. He felt his chest tighten as he stood there, waiting for the next steps to unfold. Would he be arrested? Would he be able to go on with his day as he had planned, or would his life be turned upside down in an instant? The silence between them felt endless as Karen continued to explain her concerns, while the officers asked a few more questions, trying to piece together the truth. The man stood there, trying to remain calm, but inside, he was shaking. He didn't know how to fix this, and he couldn't believe that all of this had started with one simple misunderstanding. The silence hung heavily in the air as the police officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of what to make of the situation. The man, still standing beside his car, could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. The last thing he expected after moving into this peaceful neighborhood was to be questioned by the police. He had done nothing wrong. He was just trying to enjoy a quiet morning, but now everything felt different. It was as if his very presence was under scrutiny. Karen, still standing across the street, looked on with a sense of satisfaction. Her posture was rigid, as if she believed she had done the right thing. She held her clipboard tightly in her hand, her eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before her. She had called 911, and in her mind, that was the right thing to do. She had seen the man opening the garage, and something about it had felt off. Maybe it was just a gut feeling, but she couldn't ignore it. She had acted, thinking that her responsibility as a good neighbor was to keep the community safe. The officers, however, weren't as sure. One of them turned to the man, his voice calmer now but still filled with suspicion. "Sir, can you tell us more about this car? Is it registered in your name?" he asked, looking over the vehicle as if it might hold the key to the mystery. The man nodded, trying to stay composed. He didn't want to make the situation worse, but the frustration was beginning to build up inside him. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, "this car is mine. I've owned it for years. The registration is in my name. You can check if you want." The officer looked at him for a moment, then turned to his partner. The other officer walked over to the patrol car and began typing into the computer. The man stood there, feeling like a suspect in a crime he didn't commit. He had never been in a situation like this before. He was just a man who wanted to live a quiet life in a new neighborhood, but now it felt like his every action was being questioned. As the officer continued typing, the man's thoughts drifted. How had this happened? Why had Karen felt the need to call the police on him? He didn't even know her, and yet, here he was, standing in front of her, being accused of something he hadn't done. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. It wasn't just about the car, it was about how he had been treated from the moment he arrived in the neighborhood. He had hoped for a peaceful life, but now he felt like an outsider. A stranger in his own home. The officer at the car computer glanced over at his partner, his expression thoughtful. The first officer came back to the man and gave him a small nod. We've checked the registration. Everything looks good. This car is indeed yours. The man let out a small breath of relief, but it didn't change the fact that he was still standing there, being questioned. He felt a sense of injustice, like he had been judged before he had even had a chance to explain himself. At that moment, Karen, still watching from her position across the street, spoke up again, her voice a little louder this time. I saw him. He's the one who opened the garage and started the car, she said, her tone as firm as ever. I'm just trying to make sure everyone here is safe. I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. The officers didn't respond immediately. They looked from Karen to the man and back again. The man could feel the tension building between them, and he realized that Karen wasn't going to back down. She was convinced she was right, and no amount of evidence would change that. In her mind, she had seen something suspicious, and now she expected the police to act on it. The man tried to stay calm, but the anger inside him was hard to ignore. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he took a deep breath and spoke softly. I'm not a thief. I've lived my life trying to do the right thing. I don't know why you think I would steal a car. Karen didn't seem to hear him. She was still focused on the situation, her eyes wide with a mix of concern and determination. It was clear that in her mind, he was guilty until proven innocent. She had already made up her mind. One of the officers, sensing the growing tension, stepped forward. He turned to Karen and spoke with authority. Ma'am, we've checked the registration. Everything is in order. The car belongs to this man. He's not committing any crime. You should be more careful when making accusations like this. Karen didn't react right away. Instead, she stood there for a few moments, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had expected the officers to side with her, but now it was clear that her call had been a mistake. The reality of the situation was slowly starting to sink in. She had overreacted, and her accusations had led to an unnecessary confrontation. But she wasn't ready to back down yet. I just thought it was strange, she muttered, more to herself than to the officers. He looked out of place. The officer shook his head, clearly losing patience. We all look out of place sometimes, ma'am. That doesn't mean we should jump to conclusions. I suggest you think before you make calls like this again. There was an awkward silence as Karen seemed to realize the severity of her actions. The man, still trying to process everything, felt a mix of relief and frustration. Relief because he wasn't going to be arrested, but frustration because the damage had already been done. His reputation in the neighborhood was now tainted, and it would take more than a simple apology from Karen to fix that. The officer turned to the man and offered him a small, apologetic nod. Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. You're free to go. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood there for a few seconds, trying to calm himself. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Karen. She still stood across the street, watching him with a mixture of guilt and defiance. As the man got into his car, he could feel the eyes of the neighborhood on him. Some of the neighbors had gathered around, watching the entire situation unfold. Some looked sympathetic, while others avoided making eye contact. It was clear that this incident had stirred up feelings of discomfort and division. The man couldn't help but wonder how things would be between him and his neighbors from now on. He started the car and slowly backed it out of the driveway, trying to shake off the tension that had built up. He needed to clear his head, to get away from the scene. As he drove down the street, he couldn't help but feel that his first real experience in the neighborhood had been marred by a simple misunderstanding, one that had turned into something much bigger than it needed to be. But even as he left the neighborhood behind, the thoughts lingered. He couldn't help but feel like this was only the beginning of something more. Something that had to do with more than just a car. Something that had to do with how people saw him, how they judged him, simply because of the color of his skin. The man drove slowly through the neighborhood, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the events that had just unfolded. The officers, Karen's accusations, the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach, it all felt like a bad dream. He couldn't believe that something so simple as opening his garage had turned into such a mess. As he made his way down the street, he noticed a few people standing in their front yards, looking in his direction. It was hard to ignore the stares. He could feel their eyes on him, some curious, others judging. He wasn't sure what they were thinking, but he knew it wasn't good. They had seen the police cars, the flashing lights, the scene that had unfolded in front of everyone. He had tried to explain himself, but in the end, Karen's accusations had caused more damage than he ever expected. He had hoped for a peaceful life here, a place where he could just be himself, but now, he felt like an outsider. The whispers, the stares, it was as if he no longer belonged. He felt like he was being judged for something he hadn't done, and it hurt more than he could explain. The neighborhood, once a place of promise, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The fresh start he had been hoping for seemed farther and farther away with every passing moment. He had moved to this quiet street to escape the noise and stress of his old life, but now it seemed like the noise had followed him. He reached the end of the street and made a sharp turn, hoping the change in scenery would help clear his mind. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away from the scene, from Karen, from the police, from all the judgment he had just experienced. His thoughts turned inward as he drove, wondering if this was something he would have to face every day now. Would he always be seen as the person who had been accused of stealing a car? Was that the image he would carry with him, even though he had done nothing wrong? He tried to push the thoughts aside, focusing on the road instead. But it wasn't easy. The anger still simmered inside him. Not just at Karen, but at the whole situation. He knew that people like Karen existed, but he hadn't expected to encounter one so soon. It felt like a punch to the gut. He had always believed that people were generally good, that most of them would give him the benefit of the doubt. But that wasn't the case here. Here, in this neighborhood, he felt like an outsider, a target. The man's grip on the wheel tightened as his frustration began to build. He thought about all the times in his life when he had been unfairly judged, when his character had been questioned just because of the color of his skin. It was an old feeling, one he had carried with him for years, but today, it felt different. Today, it was raw. It was real. And it was hurtful. But as much as the situation angered him, he knew there was nothing he could do about it right now. Karen had already made her accusation, and the damage had been done. There was no going back. He couldn't undo the fact that she had called the police on him, that she had looked at him and immediately assumed the worst. It didn't matter that he was a good person, that he had done nothing wrong. To her, he was just another suspicious figure in a neighborhood that didn't know him. He made another turn, this time onto a quieter road. The trees along the side of the street were full of colorful leaves, their vibrant reds and oranges providing a stark contrast to the heaviness in his chest. For a brief moment, he let himself relax, taking in the beauty of nature, trying to escape the weight of the situation. But even as he admired the trees, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. His world had shifted, and there was no going back to the way things had been. He drove for a while longer, trying to clear his mind. Eventually, he found himself on a side street, parked by the side of a small park. He shut off the engine and sat in silence for a few moments, staring out the window at the empty swings swaying gently in the breeze. The park, like everything else, seemed quiet and calm on the outside, but inside, he was anything but calm. The anger, the confusion, the hurt, it all bubbled up inside him, threatening to spill over. He thought about Karen again, wondering what had gone through her mind when she made that call. Did she really believe he was stealing the car? Or had it been something else, something deeper? Maybe she hadn't liked the fact that a black man had moved into the neighborhood. Maybe she hadn't liked the fact that he was living in a space she thought was hers to control. It didn't matter now. What mattered was that he had been the target of her suspicion, and it had shaken him to his core. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to center himself. He couldn't let this define him. He couldn't let this one encounter ruin his life. He had to move on. He had to rise above it. But even as he told himself this, he knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't that easy to shake off the sting of racism, the sting of being treated like you didn't belong. It wasn't easy to forget the look in Karen's eyes, the way she had pointed at him and accused him without a second thought. The way she had treated him like a criminal, even though he had done nothing wrong. For a long time, he sat there in the car, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The quiet of the park did little to ease his mind. The more he thought about it, the angrier he became. How could she have done this to him? How could she have ruined what should have been a simple morning, a morning where he was just trying to enjoy his new life? He knew he had to go back. He couldn't stay out here forever. He had responsibilities. He had to face the reality of the situation. But as he started the car again, he knew that things had changed. The neighborhood had changed. And he didn't know if it would ever be the same again. He drove back toward his house, the quiet hum of the engine filling the space inside the car. As he turned onto his street, he saw that some of the neighbors were still outside, lingering near their lawns, as if they were waiting for something. They must have heard about the incident by now. They must have seen the police cars, the flashing lights, the scene that had played out. He wasn't sure what they thought of him, but he could feel their eyes on him as he drove by. Their gazes were heavy, full of judgment, full of questions. He didn't know what they were thinking, but he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The man slowly pulled into his driveway, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. He sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the front door of his house. The house that had once felt like a fresh start, a place of hope, now felt like a prison. Every inch of the neighborhood seemed to be watching him, waiting for him to make a move. He felt like a stranger in his own home, his peace shattered by a simple, unjust accusation. He hadn't wanted any of this. All he wanted was to live quietly, to settle into his new life and get to know his neighbors. But now, everything had changed. The feeling of being watched, of being judged for something he hadn't done, was overwhelming. It didn't matter that he had been cleared by the police. It didn't matter that the registration of his car was in his name. In the eyes of some, he was still guilty. The damage had already been done. As he stepped out of the car, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would the neighbors be supportive? Would they understand that he was the victim here? Or would they side with Karen, the woman who had called the police on him without hesitation? He walked slowly up to his front door, his steps heavy with the weight of the situation. As he reached for the doorknob, he heard voices coming from across the street. A few of the neighbors had gathered in front of Karen's house, and he could see them talking to her, gesturing in his direction. He didn't need to hear their conversation to know what was being said. It was obvious that the story had already spread, and now, the whole neighborhood knew. The man's stomach tightened as he realized how quickly things had escalated. His name, his face, and the events of the morning were now public knowledge. He could already imagine the gossip spreading, the whispers behind closed doors, the judgment that would follow him for days, weeks, maybe even longer. He opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him with a quiet click. He leaned against it for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. His mind was racing. Should he confront Karen? Should he talk to the neighbors and try to explain himself? Or should he just stay inside, avoid the confrontation, and hope that things would blow over? As he walked through the house, he noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that made the tension in his chest feel even heavier. He had always liked the peace, the calmness of his new home, but now, the silence felt like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. He moved to the kitchen, hoping that a glass of water would help, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the same question: why had Karen done this? What had made her so quick to judge him? He thought about the moment when he first arrived in the neighborhood. He had hoped for a fresh start, a place where he could be accepted without question. But now, he was realizing that not everyone shared that same vision of peace and acceptance. Some people, like Karen, were quick to see something suspicious in him, something that wasn't even there. He wondered if his race had played a part in it, if he had been singled out simply because of the color of his skin. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the cool wood. He didn't want to make assumptions, but it was hard to ignore the possibility. Karen had never spoken to him, had never taken the time to get to know him. She had made up her mind the moment she saw him in his driveway, and that was all it took for her to decide that he was a threat. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. The fact that someone could treat him like that, accuse him of something without even knowing him, it stung. It was as if everything he had worked for, everything he had hoped for, had been thrown away in an instant. His dignity, his reputation, all of it felt like it had been taken from him. He stood up, pacing back and forth in the kitchen. The anger inside him was rising, but he knew he couldn't let it get the best of him. He had to stay calm. He had to handle this the right way. He had to prove that he wasn't the person Karen thought he was. But how? How could he make her and the rest of the neighborhood understand that he was just a man trying to live his life? The thought of confronting Karen was tempting, but he knew it would only make things worse. If he went over there and demanded an apology, it would only escalate the situation. People would see him as the angry black man, the one who couldn't let things go. That wasn't how he wanted to be seen. He wanted to be the calm, reasonable person, the one who could handle adversity without resorting to anger. So, he decided to take a different approach. He would wait. He would let the situation settle down, give it time. But he wouldn't forget. He couldn't. The next time he saw Karen or any of the neighbors, he would be ready. He would speak up, not in anger, but in truth. He would make them see that he was not the person they had painted him to be. But even as he thought this, he knew it wouldn't be easy. The damage had already been done. The first impression had been made, and it would take more than a few kind words to erase the stain that had been left on his reputation. He could already imagine the looks he would get the next time he saw his neighbors. The hesitant glances, the awkward silences. He wasn't sure if they would ever look at him the same way again. The man sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the situation once more. It was hard to shake off the feeling of isolation, of being the outsider. But he couldn't let it defeat him. He had to move forward. He had to prove that he belonged here, that he was just as worthy of this neighborhood as anyone else. The next day, the man decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was early in the morning, and the streets were quiet. As he walked, he passed by a few houses, noting that some of the lights were already on. He wondered if anyone was awake, if anyone would be out there. He thought about stopping by and talking to some of the neighbors, trying to clear the air, but he quickly dismissed the idea. It wasn't the right time. He needed to gather his thoughts, to figure out how to approach the situation without making things worse. As he walked, he noticed a few people standing outside, chatting with each other. He saw Karen's house in the distance, but he didn't approach it. Instead, he kept walking, keeping his head down, trying to avoid making eye contact. He didn't want to start anything yet. Not until he was ready. The walk gave him some peace, but the questions were still there. What would it take to change things? Would things ever go back to the way they were before? He didn't have the answers yet, but he was determined to find them. He wasn't going to let one person's prejudice define his life. He wouldn't let Karen or anyone else take away his chance at a fresh start. As he returned to his home, he felt a small sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready to face it. One step at a time. Days passed, and the man found himself caught between hope and frustration. The neighborhood, once a place full of promise, now felt like a battleground. He couldn't shake the feeling that things had irrevocably changed. Every time he stepped outside, it felt like people were watching him. He had tried to convince himself that it was just his imagination, but the reality was that the tension was real. The event with Karen, the police, and the suspicion it had left a mark, one that would take time to fade. But even as the man wrestled with these feelings, he refused to let them control him. He knew that if he let the situation define him, if he allowed Karen's accusations to shape the way he saw himself, then she would have won. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let her or anyone else take away his dignity. He was determined to move forward, to make his presence in the neighborhood known for all the right reasons. He decided it was time to take action. Not through anger, but through understanding. He would meet his neighbors, one by one, and try to clear the air. He wasn't looking for an apology from anyone. He didn't expect that, but he wanted to be heard. He wanted to show them who he really was. He wasn't just the man who had been accused of stealing a car. He was a person with a story, with a life, with dreams and aspirations. He wasn't going to let one incident define him. The next morning, he decided to start with the house next door. It was a young couple who had moved in around the same time as he had. They were friendly enough, always waving when they saw him, but they hadn't really spoken much beyond pleasantries. Now, he hoped to change that. He knocked on their door and waited. It wasn't long before a woman opened it, smiling in surprise when she saw him standing there. "Hello," she said warmly. "How are you? What's up?" The man smiled back, trying to shake off the nerves. "Hey, I just wanted to talk for a minute. I don't know if you've heard about the incident the other day, but I just wanted to clear the air." The woman's smile faded slightly, and she looked a bit uncomfortable. "Oh, yeah, we heard. It was all over the neighborhood, honestly. I just wanted to let you know that what happened wasn't what it seemed," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't stealing anything. It was just a misunderstanding, but I know that the whole situation probably made me look bad." She looked at him thoughtfully for a moment. "I know how it is," she said, her tone softening. "It's easy for people to jump to conclusions, especially when they don't know you. We've been in that position before, so we get it." The man felt a small wave of relief. It was nice to hear that at least one neighbor understood. He appreciated her honesty, but he wasn't sure if it was enough to erase the tension that had built up. Still, he pressed on. "I just wanted to make sure you know who I am. I'm not a criminal. I'm just a guy who moved here for a fresh start. She nodded, her expression now more understanding. I can tell. And honestly, I don't think anyone around here would have thought that about you. I think it was just, well, Karen. She's always been a little quick to judge. But don't worry, people will forget about it. You're a good neighbor, and that's what matters. Thanks, he said, feeling the weight of the conversation lift a little. I appreciate that. I just don't want to be known for something I didn't do. She smiled again, a bit more warmly this time. I'm sure you won't be. People will remember the good stuff you do, not the rumors. Don't let this get to you too much. The man left their house with a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was a start. He had cleared the air with one person, and that made him feel a little bit better. As he walked back to his house, he couldn't help but think about how important it was to not let people's assumptions define him. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could control how he responded to it. And today, he had chosen to respond with understanding, not anger. Over the next few days, he made an effort to talk to more of his neighbors. Some were hesitant, unsure of how to approach the situation, but most were willing to listen. They apologized for the awkwardness, some acknowledging that Karen's accusations had stirred up unnecessary tension. One neighbor even admitted that they had felt uncomfortable when the police arrived, unsure of what was really going on. But in the end, most of them came to understand that the man wasn't the threat Karen had made him out to be. But not everyone was as willing to listen. Karen, of course, remained defensive. She didn't apologize for what she had done. Instead, she doubled down on her actions, insisting that she had just been trying to protect the neighborhood. When the man approached her, hoping for a simple conversation, she brushed him off, claiming that he was just making things worse. I don't have time for this, she had said, her voice cold. I did what I thought was right. If you don't like it, that's your problem. It stung. He had hoped for a more open conversation with her, but he knew that wasn't going to happen. She wasn't interested in understanding his side. For her, the story had already been written, and she wasn't going to change it. Even though Karen's attitude hurt, the man didn't let it bring him down. He had already made progress with the others in the neighborhood. Slowly but surely, he was building relationships with those who were willing to give him a chance. And he knew that, in the end, it was those relationships that would matter. Not the opinions of one person who refused to see beyond her own narrow perspective. A few weeks later, life in the neighborhood began to settle back into a routine. The whispers faded, and the tension that had once hung thick in the air started to lift. It wasn't perfect, and there would always be those who looked at him differently, but he had made peace with that. He knew who he was, and that was enough. The man had learned something important from this experience: the power of standing up for yourself, the importance of making your voice heard, and the strength it took to keep moving forward despite the obstacles in your way. He had faced an unjust accusation, but he hadn't let it define him. He had confronted the discomfort and found a way to rise above it. And, in the end, he had found the courage to rebuild his life, one step at a time.